After a crushing loss in World War I, Germany found themselves heavily sanctioned through the Treaty of Versailles. These terms were forced upon them by Allied forces, leaving Germany voiceless and deeply punished for having started the war, according to the Allies. In order to rally the public, blame for these severe reparations was largely placed on minority groups who had little to no say in the German socio-economic landscape. This intersectionality of religion, nationality, and socioeconomic status, ability, and sexuality left many of Germany's more than 60 million inhabitants at the time in harm's way, powerless at the hands of Hitlerism. Adolf Hitler rose to power as Germany faced economic hardship following the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. One of Germany's most significant financial losses following World War I was the loss of land and territories, including the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia inhabited by former Germans. By blaming minority groups for the Treaty of Versailles and for Germany's defeat in World War I, Hitler was able to rally German public support behind him and justify the occupation of both demilitarized zones and former German lands as an attempt to reunite the Aryan race with the goal of restoring the German Empire as a prosperous global power. As we have seen unfold time and time again throughout the course of history, the oppression of minority groups was used to justify and centralize power and wealth. The wartime persecution of minority groups in Nazi Germany is a unique form of oppression and prejudice because intersectionality was secondary to these minority groups' experiences. In this film, we are going to interpret Hitler's oppression of minority groups through a socioeconomic, nationalist, and ableist lens, while also considering solidarity among these same groups within the Axis powers. We'll also look regarding the intersectionality of these, belonging to multiple targeted groups at once did not substantially alter one's treatment. Membership in any minority group was sufficient to be heavily oppressed. The most well-known group oppressed during the Holocaust was undoubtedly the Jewish population, but Romas, or Gypsies, homosexuals, mentally or physically challenged individuals, Soviet POWs, and numerous other groups were persecuted through forced labor, imprisonment, and concentration and death camps. By looking at minority groups which were oppressed during the Holocaust, we can begin to understand similarities and common factors shared by these groups, but it is difficult to research or provide evidence of any large-scale solidarity which occurred between the minority groups discussed. One of the most obvious reasons for this is that these minorities had such little power, such fierce restrictions on their thoughts and actions, that looking at their circumstances, any solidarity they could have held would be restricted to individual concentration camps, where there's no record of any solidarity, just as there's no record of any activity whatsoever, a historical black hole, so to speak. To achieve a better understanding of the solidarity which can emerge from mutual oppression, we must turn our attention to the Allied forces.
One of the most interesting concepts covered in Cultural Competence and Humility is solidarity through mutual oppression. We explored this idea with Pride, wherein Britain's LGBT community found an ally in the Welsh mining community, and vice versa. Di Donovan, a leader of the Welsh Mining Union, put it best when he said the following in reference to the LGBT community. "What you've given us is friendship. When you're in a battle against an enemy so much bigger, so much stronger than you, then to find out you had a friend you never knew existed, well, that's the best feeling in the world. So thank you." In the face of adversity, diversity blossoms. When everything is on the line, we as humans lose the ability to discriminate. Discrimination is a privilege which in a perfect world would never be enacted, but in reality is enacted by dominant groups. When these dominant groups lose power, they lose their ability to discriminate. Although stripping groups of their power is not a viable means to end discrimination, examples such as Welsh miners and LGBT community show what is possible when groups are, albeit circumstantially forced, to work together. The solidarity seen between Welsh miners and the LGBT community parallels the solidarity and intergroup connections made some 40 years earlier during the Second World War.
Within the Allied forces, the threat of Axis domination meant cooperation was necessary between the dominant and minority groups. It is the same mentality that led early American colonists to join forces with Native Americans to defeat Old World powers in the French and Indian War. Turning the gaze back to World War II, Winston Churchill was optimistic for the future of humanity during Britain's finest hour, stating in a speech given to the public on November 12, 1939, "The whole world is against Hitler and Hitlerism. Men of every race and clime feel that this monstrous aberration stands between them and the forward move which is their due, and for which the age is ripe. Even in Germany itself, there are millions who stand aloof from the seething masses of criminality and corruption constituted by the Nazi party machine. Let them take courage amid perplexities and perils, for it may well be that the final extinction of a baleful domination will pave the way to a broader solidarity for all the men in all the lands that we could ever have planned if we had not marched together through this fire." Churchill outlines an ambitious future for the world in a post-World War II era. Alas, as we have seen across recorded history, these moments of solidarity are momentary and fleeting. There is nothing beautiful about war. Countless historical figures have vehemently disgraced war as mankind's worst invention. Perhaps Abraham Lincoln put it best when he said, "I'll destroy my enemies when I make them my friends." At great moral cost, national and global conflicts have a tendency to bring previously at odds factions together for a common purpose, albeit a largely immoral purpose: war. If this sentiment could be carried through into peace times, the world would be a more conscious, competent, and accepting place for all its inhabitants. By necessity, proletariat sexism largely disappeared during World War II as well. This can be seen in domestic manufacturing in the United States, the most iconic example of which is Rosie the Riveter. Rosie serves as a representation of women working in factories and on assembly lines as part of the war effort, taking jobs which were male-dominated during times of peace. While men dominated the front lines of battle and conflict zones in Europe and across the Pacific, women were needed and encouraged to serve their country at home. The roles women assumed in factories during the Second World War are positions which previously would have been unavailable to them on the basis of sex. Thus, the war effort's overwhelming need for ammunition and war supplies was able to change the public perception of women in the United States in an incredibly short time frame. Although we have listed numerous fleeting improvements to the social structure as a result of solidarity and oppression during wartime, none of these improvements can still be seen today. As soon as war efforts in the United States ended, women were encouraged and ultimately forced to leave their positions in factories because men needed the jobs and their role was in the domicile. One of the biggest challenges these wartime quasi-social movements face is ingrained in the purpose of war. Fundamentally, war is fought with the intention of maintaining or expanding pre-existing social order. With this social order comes its norms, customs, and traditions. As we have shown, war efforts may require these social norms to be challenged to win the war. The state returns to its prior cultural practices and values. One can dream of a better future, such as the one Winston Churchill outlines, one in which blazing war efforts pave the way to a broader solidarity of men in all the lands. But once conflicts end, countries typically aspire to go back to the way things were before the war, to go back to the good old days.
Modern-day warfare is different. In the modern and globalized landscape we now live in, wars are fought in the background. Gone are the days of women working in factories to serve and defend their country, the days of finest hours and days which live in infamy. We therefore struggle to suggest changes in wartime mentality such that wartime solidarity may live on long after the war efforts end. Instead, we would like to point to these examples as times in history when we as humans were able to set aside our differences and stand together in solidarity with our brethren as fellow men and women. Just as we honor and memorialize war heroes for their acts of bravery and patriotism, so too should we honor and memorialize war heroes for their acts of solidarity and compassion for those around them. Seldom do we see the women of steel honored for their duties. Seldom spoken are the names of those who showed empathy and compassion for different minority groups as compatriots. Maybe we choose to forget these things because they are easier to forget than to accept and integrate into society. As future child advocates, it is collectively our job to educate and inspire the next generation. We have the power to decide who goes down in history as a hero. Nowhere is our future decided but in the present. Just as we honor great generals and leaders in war and times of crisis, so too should we honor and preserve the solidarity and intergroup relations which emerge in their purest forms during our darkest hours. In order to offer relevant solutions to the issues surrounding war and oppression, we must look at a modern-day example. At this moment, we feel the most pertinent example to consider is the war-torn Middle East, including Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, among other countries. In Western media, US soldiers are still glorified in the same ways they were in nearly every other major conflict the United States has been involved in. As our first solution, we believe that the minority group suffering should receive equal status and media glorification that our own troops receive. This has happened in the past with Malala, the girl who made global headlines for surviving after being shot in the head by the Taliban for wanting to go to school. We believe that it shouldn't take a gunshot wound to the head to be recognized as suffering. One could argue that engaging in the conflict as an external force is sufficient recognition of the suffering of others. But once the United States enters a conflict, the narrative changes from save those in need to defeat the bad guys at all costs. There is not enough emphasis placed on those deeply affected by both sides of the war. Civilians, families, and entire generations will be and have been forever affected by these Middle Eastern conflicts, which their community may not even be involved in. We therefore deem it necessary to acknowledge their priceless sacrifices made involuntarily for the benefit of others, ourselves included. None of our solutions are mutually exclusive. Any or all could simultaneously be pursued with the intention of improving the human condition. With this in mind, we believe wartime oppression and prejudice could be minimized through minimizing peacetime oppression both here at home and abroad. Many wars are fought on the basis of prejudice and oppression. By minimizing the frequency and intensity of oppression, we would likely have a ripple effect on the frequency and intensity of war in general. While this is a noble goal, we also believe it is unlikely to occur anytime soon. As we have seen with the Peace One Day initiative, perhaps one day we may achieve peace every day. As a side note, it is difficult to suggest any individual solution to the conflicts occurring in the Middle East because there isn't just a single problem occurring. To suggest one solution would be like trying to kill 47 birds with one stone. It just isn't feasible or realistically even possible. Problems in the Middle East perpetuating oppression include stagnant economic growth, religious extremism, ethnic conflict, corruption at all levels of government, and terrorism, to name a few. A single solution alone could not resolve one of these problems, let alone all of them. In fact, it is exactly this American "we can fix anything, we'll come in and handle things" mentality which often backfires and makes things worse than when we arrived. We have seen this occur in Vietnam in the 60s and are now witnessing it again in the Middle East. As future advocates of all others, it is our responsibility as a global power to acknowledge that we don't have all the answers. Instead of pretending that guns and manpower are all it takes to solve a problem, we as a country ought to recognize that change begins at the bottom, with the citizens of a region, not with its government. If there's anything to be learned from the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the protests in Hong Kong, Chile, Indonesia, the Netherlands, France, Peru, Haiti, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Israel, and the United States, a list of countries with major ongoing protests as we speak, it is that a government struggles and ceases to exist without a complacent populace. There could not have been an American Revolution had the colonists not risen up against old world powers. When this populace rises up, widespread change can be achieved. Therefore, as our final overarching solution, we believe it is essential to support and show solidarity for grassroots movements in these war-torn regions. To put it simply, we are destined to fail without the mutual support of the very citizens we are trying to aid by fighting in these conflicts. By working together, it is possible for both sides to gain a deeper appreciation of the sacrifices being made to better the human condition.